Although the TCB is compatible with Taigen and Tamiya mechanical recoil units, you also have the option of using a standard hobby servo for the recoil effect. Now, because this servo will not be associated with any specific channel on your radio transmitter, you can't use the radio to adjust the servo's endpoints or reversing. Instead, we can do that directly from the TCB board, as I'll show you here. RC output 5 is reserved for the recoil servo. And as always, if you forget, this is marked clearly on the bottom of the board. Here's what a typical recoil effect looks like. The servo moves quickly in one direction, which is the recoil, and then slowly in the other direction, known as the return to battery, or simply return. As you can see here, the servo is traveling roughly 90 degrees total, which is pretty common for a typical servo. Now we'll see how to adjust these endpoints. Dip switch 3 and 4 are used to select special setup menus on the TCB. For the servo recoil, we need to make sure that both switches are in the off position. Then to enter the menu, we're going to press and hold the input button for 2 seconds. After that, you'll see the red light on the board come on, and your recoil servo will move to the recoiled position. Let's see that now from a wider view. Press and hold the button for 2 seconds, and you'll see the servo move to the recoiled position. While in this menu, we can use the up and down movement of the turret stick to adjust the servo's endpoint. All our adjustments will only be made to one side of the servo's travel. To switch to the other side, we'll use the left and right movement of the drive stick to move to the other half of the servo's travel. We can move back and forth to each side and adjust the endpoints until we're satisfied with the servo's movement. Again, the left and right movement of the drive stick switches sides, and the up and down movement of the turret stick allows us to adjust the endpoint. Once we have the servo set up exactly how we want, press the input button briefly to exit the menu. Now we'll test our recoil movement, and it works. But what happens if our recoil servo is reversed? In other words, we want to swap the recoil and the return effects. It's easy to do this. First, we have to go back into the menu by holding the button down for 2 seconds. Then we use the up and down movement of the drive stick to reverse the servo. Exit the menu, and we'll test our recoil again. And you can see that the effect has been reversed. Now you know how to set the endpoints and the reversing of your recoil servo. In addition to that, the recoil servo has 2 more settings that can be adjusted in the OP-Config program on the Motors tab. These are time to recoil and time to return. Although they are both time settings, they operate a little bit differently. With time to recoil, you are telling the TCB how long it takes your servo to move to the recoiled position. With time to return, you are telling the TCB how long you want the servo to take to return to battery. Let's talk about the recoil time first. When the servo recoils, the TCB tells the servo to move to the recoiled position immediately. However, the servo doesn't move at the speed of light. It takes time to get to that position. There is no way for the TCB to know how long it will take. That is why we need to tell it. If we set the time to recoil too low, the servo won't make it all the way back to the recoiled position before it starts to return. In this example, the time to recoil is set at 100 milliseconds, which is 1/10 of a second. That won't be enough time for the servo in our test to recoil all the way. As you can see here, you will probably need to use some trial and error to determine the best recoil time for your servo. But a good starting point is to look at the 0 to 60 time listed in the specifications for your servo. For our test servo, the time is listed as 0.13 seconds to 60 degrees, but keep in mind this is at no load, and your servo may need to travel more than 60 degrees. The servo in our test jig is actually going to travel 120 degrees, so we'll multiply 0.13 seconds times 2, which is 260 milliseconds. Before we write any changes to the TCB, it's always a good idea to read all the settings from the TCB and then change only the ones we need. Now I'm going to change the time to recoil to 260 milliseconds. And then we'll write this change to the TCB. Now let's see if our servo has enough time to recoil all the way back. And it does. You might wonder what happens if we set the time to recoil to a number that is too high. In that case, the servo will recoil all the way back and then pause while the rest of the time expires. If you want to pause between the recoil and return, this is a good way to do it. Now let's talk about the time to return. Because the return movement is much slower, we are not constrained by the servo's maximum speed. No trial and error is necessary for the time to return. Just enter the time that you want to take, and that is how long it will. Here I am setting the time to return to 3.2 seconds, which is much slower than you would probably ever need, but this will be a good test. Hopefully now you understand all the settings related to the recoil servo: endpoint adjustments, reversing, time to recoil, and time to return.